It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And this is really one of my favorite topics to talk about is plant parasitic nematodes. And I hope I can get everything together. There's a lot to talk about with soybeans as well as cotton nematodes. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you look at the number of plant parasitic nematodes that affect cotton and soybean in the Mid-South, there's about 40. Okay. And so without taking a soil sample, you have no idea which ones of those you have. Now, primarily all of the research we spend on looking at 2 species, maybe 3. So the southern root knot nematode is one we spend a lot of time on because of how yield limiting it can be. And probably more recently than the reniform nematode, since the 40s it was identified in Louisiana, and we spent a lot of time on it. So those will be the 2 primary ones I'll talk about today. Most of you are probably familiar with some of the signs and symptoms for root knot nematode. So you have the symptoms on the cotton there, and some of the real sandy soils will find the southern root knot nematode. When that population density is really high and the soil moisture is low, a lot of times you'll see that stressed plant symptom that you see there with the cotton. The soybeans, definitely those yellow spots are indicative of a high population in a sandy soil towards the end of the season. The galling, of course, each one of those galls is going to reduce the nutrient and water uptake and really disrupts that root system, kind of as a roadblock you can think of. So with cotton, it shows up relatively early, about 45 to 60 days after planting. You can pull up one of those roots. With soybean, not so much. The nodules are actually larger early on than the galls. The difference between a nodule and a gall is you can take that nodule and rub it off. And a gall you will not be able to rub off. The image there for the soybean, that's probably about R3, R4. The galls get larger over time. And towards the end of the season, when you're harvesting, they're just black knots, and it's kind of easy to misdiagnose that. Again, another reason to take soil samples. The reniform nematode, it's not as dramatic. It's more of an embezzler as far as what yield loss is and related to as symptoms. So here we kind of see some stunting within the cotton. The cotton itself is kind of up and down, as it's referred to, along the row. And again, that soil type is probably going to make a bigger impact on it. So when that deep sands, water stress situation, those symptoms will be more dramatic. The image with the soybean plants, that's a high population of reniform nematode. It just doesn't seem to have that same dramatic appearance on soybean as it does cotton. So it's really easy to misdiagnose and allow to continue. And it doesn't seem to have as great of an impact either from a yield loss standpoint. So even that population there is really high. It's not causing the yield loss it does on cotton. And of course, the root system, you don't see any kind of galling. In the laboratory, you can see the egg masses as well as the females themselves. So this is the distribution of both root knot and reniform in the Mid-South. Of course, if you look at, definitely for Arkansas, if you look at the southern root knot nematode, that really follows the soybean production. Almost every county that has soybeans has southern root knot. And that's primarily my focus on a lot of my research because it's becoming more and more problematic. A lot of that's due to our rotation. Adding corn into our rotation has exacerbated that. Corn is a tremendously great host for increasing that population, and that's why we're seeing a lot of that more in the Mid-South. Not every county, again, has a problem with nematodes, but again, gives you an idea of that distribution. Reniform, the same thing, following a lot of the cotton and soybean production within those 3 states. So here are some thresholds. Plant pathology gets closer to entomology when it comes to nematodes. So here are some of the thresholds that we use in Arkansas for cotton, 50 to 100 J2s per 100 cc's of soil. And it's always higher with the reniform because half of the population in the soil are males. Therefore, they are do not infect any of the plants, and so those numbers will always be higher. Soybeans are definitely more sensitive to it, and that threshold is about 60. Now, most of you, if you've taken nematode samples recently, I know that some of that have come across our lab. Those numbers are much higher than what you're seeing here. So we've really created a problem in some of these fields. All right, just a little bit, some of the terminology that I will end up using. Of course, something that is a susceptible host, you get a lot of nematode reproduction. That's those little squiggly lines underneath those plants. And within that second plant there, you see it stunted. And so that is a susceptible host. Resistance to nematodes is all related to reproduction, so high reproduction. So then resistance would have less reproduction. All right, so it's a relative amount. There's nothing that is standardized. So it's just like going to the grocery store and you buy salsa. And it's hot salsa. And you say, man, it's great. I'm going to go home and have some good hot salsa. And you get home and it's mild. There's no way that that's standardized either. So it's kind of disappointing. So it's based on, if you look at the nematode population in a lot of the trials, you can get an idea of how these nematicides or how the varieties will respond. A non-host then is usually another crop completely, and there's no reproduction whatsoever. And then all the way to the end, we have tolerance and intolerance. So both of those are susceptibles. So the idea for managing nematodes is reducing the nematode population density in the soil. Those do nothing for you. Now that season, if you're growing a tolerant soybean variety, you can get a decent yield, but for the next year, you've just hurt yourself more and more. All right, so those are some of the terms that all end up being used. So here we go. So for rotation options, with a non-host crop, if you have the southern root knot nematode, those are your options. Peanuts and rice. Everything else is going to cause you a headache. And so unfortunately, there's not enough peanut acreage in our 3 states to be able to rotate with all the soybeans or cotton. And usually the rice soil is not conducive for like cotton production. Yes, sometimes it is for soybeans. Most of the time we're managing that nematode within those rice fields by flooding it as well. So that's also helping. For reniform nematode, there's a few more options. Basically anything other than cotton and soybean. So any of those grass crops do well. So although corn is great for reniform management, it is very poor for root knot management. So resistance, so within all of these, there will still be some reproduction, just less with some than others. All right, so here is, we finally have some varieties, which is very nice, that have resistance to root knot nematodes. Some of those are moderate. They would have a kind of act like a 1-gene system. Some of them have 2, but the genes are actually segregating. And then some of them that have 2 genes that are fixed, which are resistant. So nice that we have that. As we use these varieties more and more, this is why we see reniform nematode picking up, because we have no resistance available to those. There's definitely some progress being made. Hopefully at some point we get to that where we do have some that are better than others, but right now I don't have anything else to add to that. Here's just a variety trial, give you an idea of that population. That's in those blue bars. So I've both got the galling as well as the yield on the same graph here. So those blue bars for that resistant 427, hardly no reproduction. A little bit more with the moderately resistant. And of course, both of those are better than any of those susceptibles like Phytogen 499. The yield response, you can see there's a little bit of a drag within the 427 with higher resistance. So oftentimes there's a move towards something like 367 that's moderate resistant. Still better for managing the nematodes than some of the others. So a great option. We didn't have that option 15 years ago. So we're definitely moving in the right direction. Something that I spent a lot of my time on recently is evaluating some of the soybean varieties for resistance to root knot nematode. So I told you that some of the fields, you see most of the time root knot is somewhat aggregated. You'll have spots in the field that are more severe than others. This particular field is a little bit more uniform. And the population usually ranges from 700 J2s per 100 cc of soil to 1,200 or 1,500. So it's a really good screen as far as that goes. And you can see on those plots there, some of those are resistant. Those are the ones that are still green. And some of those are very susceptible and intolerant, those that are completely dead. And so you can see the significant amount of galling towards the end of the season. Given the amount of time, I won't have a chance to go through all of the different maturity groups. So I'll just share with you the maturity group 4s. So in this one, the magenta bar is the galling. So this year was definitely more stress than what we saw last year. And if you saw this data before on our website, the yields look much better. But because of the stress we had in June and July, these yields are much lower and the galling is much higher. So you can see there's a nice correlation, low galls with those first 4 or 5 varieties there, decent yields, all right. But you go down to something like our control there, Delta Grow 4970, galling of 99%, cutting 14 bushel. And that we do see in some fields and field wide in Arkansas. So definitely a need for this type of resistance. Most of those are all extremely susceptible. And if you look at that number down below, that PF value, that's the final J2s at the end of the season. So when we tell you to sample in the fall, that's a number that you can kind of reference to. But that is really low. The reason why is because all those plants started to die. The nematode's an obligate pathogen, so it also starts to drop off too. The year before that would have been 1,200, so really high. Most of those varieties are just selected because they're popular in the Mid-South. It's not that they were marketed as resistant. These others have looked good as far as resistant for the last couple of years. And the grower's field we're in, he was cutting about 15 bushel with these varieties. Now he's averaging 60 on his farm, so quite a dramatic difference. Also, I know it's hard to get all that information, but if you'll go onto that website of our Arkansas crops, this information as well as group 5s and some of the liberties are on that list as well, so definitely take a look at it. These are some that are resistant to the reniform nematode soybeans. Not as many, and this screen is done in the greenhouse. So basically just looking at population, basically compared to something that's fallow. And these are pretty close to what it would be just like having fallow ground. So depending on your rotation sequence, if you needed something that was resistant, these would be my recommendation. All right, nematicides, this will be the last topic. Often used when that resistance is limited, especially if you have reniform nematode or when you have multiple species within a field. So one of them is going to tend to increase compared to the other depending on what resistance you have available. So here are the nematicides that are registered for use in cotton. They're divided into fumigants and non-fumigants. So fumigants with Telon, Vapam, Kpam. Again, all of these nematicides are only provide 1 year protection. They do not provide subsequent years. Then the non-fumigants, I've got them divided into soil applied, and you have things like Velum Total and Aglogic. Seed applied, which is really becoming more and more. It's kind of interesting working in nematology, how many of these we have to look at. And of course, foliar with Vidate is often used with one of the soil applied or other products. So just expand on those a little bit. I know you're probably familiar with those, but Aglogic 15GG is just aldicarb or old Timic. Then the other soil applied is Velum Total, which is the fluopyram plus imidacloprid. So again, a nematicide as well as an insecticide, kind of pairing up to be similar to what the aldicarb would do. Then the seed applied chemicals. Avicta, which has been around for a while, one of the first ones that was registered. Eris, another insecticide and nematicide product. Copial Prime, which is basically Velum as a seed treatment. And then Nemastrike, Thiazazephan, which is something I think that's supposed to be available this year. I don't have information on all of those, but we'll take a look at a few of those that are highlighted in white. The last group there is the biologicals. Votivo's been around for a while. Doesn't seem to me as popular on cotton as it is on soybeans. And Bio-ST nematicide, which is basically heat-killed Burkholderia bacteria. And so the mode of action there I'm not so sure about. With the Bacillus firmus, that bacteria stays active and living. It's kind of interesting, especially from the nematologist, the things that we're working with are having more of a caution label, so it's definitely nice to work with those products. They're a little safer for the handler. All right, I'll yield to my co-authors here on this National Cotton Council Nematode Research Committee. They're the ones who shared this data with me, and so they get credit for it as well. So basically the objective was just looking how these seed and soil applied nematicides worked in cotton. Though we all used the same protocol, everybody took galling rating a little bit differently. I think galls are a better indication of your nematicide efficacy than the soil counts. So everybody took something a little bit different, whether that was percentage of galling or counts, and so I just rated them based on rank. So however you rated them, the lowest would be the best. So if you're looking at a seed-applied nematicide, the Copio Prime actually did the best. And here my numbers, it's similar to the Eris and Copio Prime, so that's probably a rounding error. The soil-applied nematicide itself would have been Velum Total at 18 ounces. It was numerically better than everything else. And the combination of the Copio plus the Velum Total at 10 ounces actually did the best for everybody. And that was quite interesting. That was one of the first times that we've looked at that combination. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this year if this trend still holds through. Yield response-wise, the Velum Total at 14 ounces basically was better than the Eris. If you do enough of these trials, this is very common. The things that are showing the best reduction in nematodes don't always show the best yield response, with the Velum Total products doing a little bit better than the seed applied themselves. Here's in a reniform field, those same treatments, and at the very end you see AgLogic, so it was included here, but it wasn't with the root knot trials. As far as the nematicide itself, the Copio Prime plus the Velum Total at 10 ounces actually did better than the fungicide base. Everything else was pretty similar, ran pretty similar, and as well as for the yield response, all of them were pretty much flat. So maybe providing a little bit of protection there, but not as much as probably the variety response if we would ever get to that point. So we're seeing some subtle additive effects by these nematicides, more than dramatic effect you see with the host plant resistance. So this is just one of these, what they call them, piano graphs, looking at all the data set over against the insecticide Gaucho. And so you can see a wide variation there. And the treatments you can see down below by the asterisk. But if you compare just to the insecticide Gaucho, 50% of the time, something with a seed-applied nematicide had a better yield benefit. And that just means it could be 2 pounds of seed cotton. Just anything over that. I'm not saying that that's going to be profitable. It was just greater. Something for the soil applied part, whether that's AgLogic or Velum Total, it was about 70% of the time. So definitely a much better chance there. Some of the reason and a lot of that variation that we do see is a little bit of rainfall. So these are all non-fumigant contact nematicides. So water has to distribute them from that point of application down through the root system. No water, no protection. Also the different soil types. So the sandier soils, some of these, the nematicide physical properties hold on to clay particles. They hold on to organic matter better. Less organic matter, more sandy soil, they're actually going to move a little bit more. And not huge amounts, but we're talking about inches. So, and then the nematode population density will also have an effect on the yield benefit from those nematicides. All right, then quickly through the soybean group. So again, we have the same fumigants and non-fumigants. Again, I'll focus on the seed-applied nematicides. Those are the ones that are probably the most popular and I get the most questions on. The names here, pretty much similar to what we saw before. The only thing difference is we're changing the name for the seed-applied fluopyram from Copioprime to Alivo. So same product, a little different rate, but still the same. And a lot more of the biologicals have come in, so I won't repeat the ones that I've already talked about, but we do have the VOEZ, which is Bacillus amyloliquefaciens. Again, I'm not really sure the mode of action that's related to that product, but another biological. And then the Chloriva PN, and that's just for soybean cyst nematode alone. So you wouldn't use that in a root knot field. You would not use that in a reniform field. It is only for soybean cyst nematodes. And then those that are highlighted, I'll share with you just one trial about it. And this is that same field. So what I've circled over there is the seed applied nematicide study. Those green plots there, unfortunately, that is not a seed applied nematicide. That's a resistant variety. Okay. So again, looking at galling about 35 days after planting gives me the best idea of how much product efficacy that we're seeing. So here, this is just one trial that we had this past year. So the orange bars are the percent galling. On average, it's about 36. So something like Avicta was lower than that. Votivo was lower, and as well as the Alivo Votivo product would have actually been numerically lower. And that's pretty similar to a lot of the trends that I see in a lot of my other trials. Those three products tend to come out on top. The yield response here, the products that had the Alivo did best. Alivo does have some activity against sudden death syndrome, which this field has no history of, so I have to believe that this is mostly due to the nematicide. So pretty positive, not as much from the BioST or the VOEZ, but again, this is, haven't looked at those for more than just a year or two now. See what they look like after a few more years. Also, the population there, that final population of 308 J2s per 100 cc's, that's pretty high for a seed-applied nematicide. I'd rather be down there closer to 60. So again, sampling early, knowing what your population is also going to be helpful, give you more options to use some of these seed-applied nematicides. That's probably a little high for it. All right, this is just my data. And this is from 2015 to 2017 of primarily some of the Alivo Votivo products. And you see the distribution there. In this case, I'm just trying to give you a percentage that was over 2 bushels an acre. I kind of feel like with beans, there's about that much variation between years anyway. So that was about 45% of the time. So anytime I was using a seed-applied nematicide, I got a yield benefit 45% of the time. So you can decide yourself how profitable that is for you. Again, some of the same similarities within that variation. The things that are going to have probably the most dramatic effect is rainfall. Here we have a little bit more broader range of different nematicides, so that nematicide physical property is also going to have effect. Something like Avicta is a very large molecule. Definitely does not move very far. It's very toxic, and it breaks down after about 30 days. Something like Alivo is a little smaller molecule. It lasts much longer. Its half-life is getting into the 200 to 300 day range. And so it's lasting a lot longer, so it's going to be around, and the efficacy is going to be greater for a longer period of time. So that's also going to be an issue. And also retention on seed. It's definitely interesting that if you compare even cotton seed to soybean seed, there seems to be even more retention of these nematicides on the soybean seed than the cotton seed, and that may be due to some of the calcium carbonate that maybe still be used, or some of the other polymers that are being used on cotton seed. And of course, the nematode population density definitely would like to be lower than what I had here, and I probably see a little bit more efficacy out of these. All right, with that, that is the end of my story. Definitely, it's important to sample. Knowing which nematode you have, you're going to know which deployment system you're going to use. Resistance is probably the best that you're going to see out there, but resistance does not mean immune. So definitely looking at some of that variation. And just because it says soybean nematode resistance doesn't mean it's resistant to all of them that's out there. Our nematicides, I think pairing those with something that's moderately resistant is definitely going to be better than the highly susceptibles that we have out there. So if you have questions about my talk, or you don't have a chance to catch me later, that's my contact information. You're more than welcome to reach out to me.